the topic today, some of you said you were interested in counterterrorism. Well, today we're going to talk about sort of the ultimate form of terrorism, city busting. And it has a tradition, and it's a controversial means of waging war. Controversial because it's not clear what the morality is of it. We'll get into that. Much of the organization of our government and other governments, defense and foreign affairs systems, are organized around this fear. And if you're trying to understand the news and why, we can't tell you why we're watching you. It has something to do with the fears associated with this. By the way, I'm not a big fan of that idea. We need more debate. Someone said debate. You should try to get a debate about that going here. Yeah, that's your mission. All right. In any case, to understand the Cold War, and I would argue the post-Cold War, this lecture is somewhat useful. We'll see. All right. Now, what are we going to talk about? 5 things. We can read them off, probably worth doing. How was city busting viewed and done before and during the Second World War? The watershed event, of course, is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But was that something unusual or in some context? By the way, I should stop right here. I'm going to behave like El Doctore, but you shouldn't allow it. Interrupt. By the way, your mission as students is mostly to interrupt. If you don't interrupt, you're not really a student.
Great. Can you tell me what city busting is in a general definition? I'm not familiar with the term.
I was imagining Dresden.
It's very good.
That's what
Okay.
And by the way, we have pictures.
So is this just like attacking cities as in attacking military?
Trying to kill as many people in one bombing run as you can. And like a bank, you go there because the money's there. If you want to find people, you go to cities. That's where they are. Yeah. So, in a nutshell, that's it. And right. So, interruptions, please. May make things easier, actually. Okay, so that's the first question. The second is, what is the revolution associated with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons? Everyone talks about it being a revolution. First of all, what did it consist of, and how significant was it? Then a kind of ancillary question, why initially did developing larger nuclear weapons seem logical? I mean, you could develop nuclear weapons, say, fine, enough already. Why did they go further and further? And what was the thinking there? Then a word about the counter-revolution, which is precision guidance. Some of you mentioned your interest in intelligence. Military intelligence is about targeting to an extent which you will not imagine until you get into working in these fields. Without precision guidance, there would be no need for that intelligence because you wouldn't be able to hit anything you could find anyway. That's not the case. Now, if you can see it, you can hit it, and you're likely to be able to destroy it. It's just a question of timeliness. But how did this revolution constitute a counter-revolution to nuclear energy or nuclear weapons? And then finally, a word on city busting again today. Why might its morality still be an issue? Is this a desiccated lecture about history, or is it relevant? I would argue relevant. Okay, let's get started. Again, interrupt, right? We got that? Okay, cool. Until modern times, which I I guess, is roughly, I'll say, Machiavelli. I'm watching The Borgias, which I recommend. It's a pretty vulgar Netflix series, but it hones in what modernity is about. But until then, targeting cities was definitely frowned upon. I think even for most of modernity it was. Taking a quote, it wasn't that they didn't do it, it's just it wasn't considered the best thing to do. And this is a remarkable quote by Sun Tzu. He says the first thing is to attack someone's strategy. That's the reason you're here, to learn about how countries compete and how to undo their modes of competition so that you can have development instead of bombing. We want to diffuse certain forms of competition that are nasty. Well, but then you have to understand how the other fellow thinks. Then disrupting alliances comes next. Then, if you must, you attack his army. The worst policy is to attack the cities. Put that in red. The first example reflecting on history that I could come up with, there may be others, but I think this is a pretty good place to start, was the Shermans March to the Sea, Civil War. And this is a very interesting case because it was definitely an instance where a city was destroyed, but in a way, it was pretty civilized. It took about 6 months to actually take Atlanta militarily. And when Sherman was going to move on to his next objective, which was Savannah, he decided that he was not going to leave Atlanta without destroying the military, industrial capabilities and production plants that would assist the Confederacy. So he destroyed the rail yards and the rail system and a number of other foundries and the like. However, he did not destroy all of Atlanta. People, I was not tutored in this point. I thought, well, you see the flames, Atlanta's burned, that's it. No, 30%. He spared the hospitals, the churches, and almost all of the residences. He also told everyone who was in the city to leave so they would not get hurt.
How much did you burn? How much percentage?
30?
30. Roughly. I don't know if they had a measuring stick, but that's what's in the histories. So he then went to Savannah. Have any of you bothered to go down to Savannah? Have you been there? It is really a neat place. And the reason it's neat is nothing has been destroyed. The Confederates fled, more or less. The mayor said, please don't burn the city. Here are the keys. And so the place was spared. By the way, very smart mayor. Knew how to add. And it helped bring the war to an end. It was a major victory. So that's sort of your earliest case, I think. Then there's a sort of interregnum. It takes a while. The French, however, start thinking after the Civil War about their British competitors. They see the British as the enemy. Turned out that wasn't the case, but you start where you started. And there was a novel that actually was quite powerful in the imagination of the French military and the public. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, it turns out, again, something which I did not appreciate and that I think is not generally remembered. the French were very advanced in thinking about submarine warfare. And torpedo boats. Why? Well, they were thinking about how they could defeat the British without having to build ship for ship and an enormous capital fleet, the British. French could not afford that, or decided they didn't want to. And they didn't want to invade Great Britain. So the question was, how do we deal with this competitor? And they said, well, what if we develop submarines and torpedo boats so that we can blockade commerce to and from and make the capital ships vulnerable? Then we can have our way without having to invade. Because we don't have a very large army, we don't want to bleed either. So they got serious. The first picture is of one of the first practical submarines. The second, the Narval, was an international competition that they put out. And you can see the boats get pretty big. This is, I want to say 98. The Z class was the first submarine to sink. If you can see in the distance, let's see here. See this? That's a battleship. That sank that. It was sort of, if you remember pictures of Billy Mitchell sinking a battleship with an airplane, this was the first instance of a submarine sinking the capital ship. It wasn't clear you could do it, but they did it. They then had a fleet of these submarines. So, submarine warfare, we think about the Germans. It's a little unfair. They plagiarized. It was the French first. Now, turns out, you'll find the first examples of international arms control about this time. And what did they focus on? Among other things, submarine warfare. They said this is, if you will, a kind of, they didn't say the word strategic weapon, but they considered it to be a major problem, such that they said that, well, at the very least, you can't use these submarines except against military combatants. You can't use them against civilian ships. The problem then, of course, well, first of all, the Germans did copy, and they bested the French. They developed Uboats. And the other thing is, it turns out the distinction between civil and military cargo ships, not so bright, more gray. Lusitania was carrying, supposedly, war material. And so unrestricted warfare began. And the Germans started thinking all sorts of things. Now, it turns out, however, the development of anti-submarine munitions, convoys, destroyers, defeated the problem such that the submarine warfare gambit did not produce the strategic results the Germans hoped for. But they get an A for effort. They were thinking. They had malice in their hearts. This is a kind of strategic weapon. High leverage, hard to defeat, and they thought would produce victory-denying results, or better yet, victory itself. At the same time, the horrors of trench warfare rekindled an interest in attacking political capitals in a different way. Here's an example which is hard to get our heads around today. How many people have died who are allied combatants in Afghanistan? I mean, by the way, you can get the figure wrong, but I mean, roughly. Is it 1 million?
That's really low.
6,000?
Yeah, it's thousands. Keep that in mind. By the way, we're pulling out because it's intolerably hot. Yeah? Well, what if I was to tell you that in one campaign that took approximately 16 weeks, 300,000 combatants were killed and 1 million casualties. It's called the Battle of the Somme. By the way, for this, I believe the number is, let's see here, it was, I want to get this right. Hang on here. Have to look at my notes. I don't normally do that.
Was that in France?
Oh, very much so.
Are you talking about the first day?
That was over 4 months.
In the class I'm taking right now, Professor Tierney said on the first day there were 60,000 that died.
That sounds right. Because after the first day, they had the good sense to stay in the trenches longer. Right. Let's see here. The figure I wanted to give you is the following. There we go. Right. 7 miles were captured along a 19-mile front in exchange for 300,000 allies. By the way, this doesn't include the casualties, which were like 1 million people missing arms, legs. So that didn't look like such a smart gambit. So the Germans thought about this and said, you know, let's fly over the lines, let's attack the political center, London, and see if we can get them to sue for peace. These are the Gotha raids. Now the Gotha raids went on for a few weeks, and they destroyed portions of London and killed just under 900 people. What's interesting about these raids is how they were handled and what conclusions were reached. First, 90 interceptor fighters went up during the first raid. Had 0 effect. Shot down 0 bombers. This helped perpetuate the myth that the heavy bomber will always get through. Yeah? Second, while barrage balloons and fighters did eventually knock down some of these bombers, it wasn't really until the British went after the Gotha bases in Europe that they were able to terminate these raids. By the way, that roughly is your first example of first strike, second strike distinction, which is if you can't survive retaliation, you might want to rethink about attacking in the first place. In any case, there were a lot of strong thoughts that came from this set of attacks. At the end of the war, you can read works by Churchill, who argued, well, the League of Nations that we're going to create should have a fleet of bombers with chemical munitions, the ultimate weapon. In fact, there were a number of other writers. These names are well known in Air Force history. We have an Italian, a Brit, and an American. And roughly what these folks argued was, we need to stop trying to bleed the enemy dry in feudal trench warfare or starving their population with blockade, which is what the British did at the end of the First World War, which you have to have an enormous fleet. It takes lots of time. It's pretty rough as well. So let's show mercy by attacking the heartland. And they then described a number of things. And part of the problem is it's a number of things, and it's not clear what they meant. Billy Mitchell, of course, is famous for trying to show that the Navy was not the end-all be-all. He took one of his planes and destroyed a German battle cruiser, and effectively, for this, he was held in contempt and seen as a dangerous element in the military. Trenchard argued as well, as did Billy Mitchell, for attacking cities. Mitchell also was an enthusiast for using chemical weapons. They talked about destroying the means of military production, industrial sites, capital ships, army bases. You name it, they were in favor of bombing it. Now, that actually presented a bit of a problem, and that is, well, what is strategic bombing? People thought about this a little, but mostly they did things. And in the interwar period, the British had lots of colonies and colonists they had to discipline. And they started using airplanes. Now, you'll notice a couple of things here that's interesting. First of all, you'll notice there's no clouds. It's sunlight. It's clear. You'll also notice that the enemy is not so sophisticated. They're on camels. So that the amount of defensive action against these air raids was not very much. You're stunned to hear that these raids were very effective. The Italians clearly were interested in bombing cities as well. They toyed with, and in fact did, try to use chemical weapons against Ethiopian targets. What's interesting is, even then, they were a bit ashamed, and they did not do it very much, nor did they need to. Conventional bombs were devastating enough. I think this gets to sort of the ambiguity of this experience during the interwar period. There was an effort in the 30s to ban chemical bombing. I think in 25 there was a Geneva Protocol to prohibit the use of poison gas. I think there also was the hope, given this experience, that, well, you didn't need it anyway. You know, it was not something you had to do. You did not have to bomb with chemicals. And going into the Second World War, this experience had a kind of interesting impact, no pun intended, on the thinking of the French, the British, and the Germans. First, the British did not really invest in a large bomber fleet anyway. So the idea that they could do strategic bombing of major German cities at the outset of the war was not in the cards. Second, the French were a bit apprehensive about ideas about doing anything like that anyway, because they sensed they would be the ones hit first. Also, there was a tremendous and fortunate interest on the part of British war planners in things that would defend against air attacks. The invention of radar, the development of really fast and super capable fighter interceptors like the Spitfire and the Hurricane. That's where the effort went initially. And in 2020 hindsight, it seems like they had that one right. Had they not done that, things, we might be speaking German right now. So the initial thought was, don't attack cities. However, there were some cautionary cases that were, I would argue, more accidental than purposeful. First of all, one of the reasons the French were apprehensive about being attacked had to do with the experience of Rotterdam and the Dutch. It turns out that the Germans tried to take Rotterdam and there was resistance. And they actually reached an agreement that if the resistance gave up, the Luftwaffe would not attack Rotterdam. They got an agreement, and I don't know what happened, and it's very unclear when you read the history. The Germans apparently didn't get the orders or something, and they went ahead and bombed Rotterdam anyway. They killed about 900 people in the center of the city. And then they decided to make lemonade out of this. They threatened to do it to Utrecht, another major Dutch city. And the Dutch said, okay, we give up. That's it. They surrendered the whole country. The next example was the Battle of Britain, which in a way was an accident as well. Hitler was not that enamored of the idea that was being proposed by some of his air generals to go attack London. He said, well, no, wait a minute. How does that help the war effort? It seems like a diversion. Unfortunately, in trying to attack military industrial targets outside of London, some of the bombers dropped their bombs on residential areas close to London. This caused the British to feel as though they had to retaliate, and they did against Berlin. That then resulted in Hitler saying, okay, and he started to attack London. 20,000 to 30,000 dead people later, the Battle of Britain was over. Hitler's Luftwaffe was defeated with regard to its ability to impose its will on the British. And the takeaway was, well, that didn't work. That's how the war's initial period taught folks about city busing. It was not obvious, even as late as the end of 1940, that if you had an airplane with bombs, the thing you would go after is cities, despite all of this. Now, in fact, the initial targets that the British went after with their bombers was in support of the Navy. They went after the sub-pens in France. There's only one problem, well, a couple of problems. First of all, you'll notice that's pretty good reinforcement. That's all concrete and rebar. You had to really have a large bomb, and it had to hit precisely the right place to even get through the protection pens. Not only that, but to do that, you had to go during daylight. Well, they'd done it during the interwar period. Big difference, though. The Nazis had interceptor fighter aircraft and air defense guns. The British bombers were dropping out of the sky, so they had to change tactics. They had to fly at night against bigger targets, industrial targets, rail yards. And they did. Now, this picture, which Kate Harrison, who actually went to this school, I don't know if knowing that she works for me is